Imagine looking up at the sky. It is a clear, crisp morning in London, 1944. The Battle of Britain is a memory. The Blitz is over. You feel a momentary sense of safety. There is no drone of heavy bomber engines, no wail of air raid sirens, no distant thud of anti-aircraft fire. The sky is empty. It is silent. And then the world ends. In a fraction of a second, a quiet street is transformed into a crater. Buildings vanish, lives are extinguished, and only after the devastation, a moment later, comes the sound. A double crack of a sonic boom, followed by the roar of an explosion that has already happened. This was a new kind of terror, a weapon that traveled faster than the speed of sound, arriving before its own warning. This was the V-2 rocket. In the annals of human conflict, few machines have held such a dual legacy. It was the vengeance weapon of a dying Nazi regime, a desperate attempt to burn the world down with them. It was built in the darkest caves of human suffering, assembled by slaves who were worked to death in airless tunnels. Yet it was also the key to the heavens. It was the grandfather of the Saturn V, the technological ancestor of the machine that would one day carry Neil Armstrong to the Sea of Tranquility. How do we reconcile these two truths? How does a machine built by a regime of hate become the vessel for humanity's greatest hope? Join us as we peel back the layers of history. We will travel from the aristocratic estates of Prussia to the secret testing grounds on the Baltic coast, from the terror-stricken streets of London to the horrific underground galleries of the Harz Mountains, and finally to the launch pads of America where the space age was born. This is the story of Wernher von Braun, the V-2 rocket, and the blood-soaked road to the stars. The boy who aimed for the moon. To understand the weapon, we must understand its creator. Wernher von Braun was not born a monster, he was born a dreamer. Born in 1912 into an aristocratic Prussian family, young Werner was a child of privilege. But while his peers were interested in hunting or politics, Werner's eyes were fixed firmly upward. He was captivated by the science fiction of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. He didn't see the moon as a distant, dead rock. He saw it as a destination. The turning point came at age 12, when his mother gifted him a telescope. That simple tube of glass and metal became a window into obsession. He spent his nights charting the craters of the moon, and his days filling notebooks with sketches of rockets. But dreams require fuel, and in the depressed, volatile Germany of the 1920s and 30s, money for space exploration was non-existent. By the time he was 18, von Braun had joined the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the Society for Space Travel. It sounds grand, but in reality, it was a group of ragtag enthusiasts, tinkering with dangerous explosives in abandoned lots in Berlin. They were the garage hackers of their day, led by the father of rocketry, Hermann Oberth. They blew things up. They failed. But occasionally, a small silver tube would hiss into the sky, and they would cheer. However, the world was changing. In 1933, the dark shadow of the swastika fell across Germany. The Nazi Party seized power, and the casual days of amateur rocketry were over. The German military, the Wehrmacht, saw potential in these toys. They weren't interested in the moon. They were interested in artillery that couldn't be intercepted. This is where the Faustian bargain was struck. The military offered von Braun everything he ever wanted: unlimited funding, state-of-the-art facilities, and the manpower to build his rockets. All he had to do was change the payload. Instead of a capsule for a human explorer, he had to design a warhead for high explosives. Von Braun later famously claimed, "I was interested in science, but I had to make a living somehow." It was a dismissal that would haunt his legacy forever. He accepted the uniform, he accepted the funding, and he accepted the mission. The dreamer had sold his soul to the warmongers, rationalizing that the path to the stars led through the battlefield. The Island of Secrets. The work required secrecy. The amateur testing grounds in Berlin were too public. The military moved von Braun and his team to a remote, windswept island on the Baltic coast, Peenemünde. If you stood on the dunes of Peenemünde in 1937, you would have seen a marvel of engineering rising from the sand. It was a purpose-built city of science. There were wind tunnels, liquid oxygen plants, vast assembly halls, and pristine housing estates for the scientists and their families. It was a techno-utopia, isolated from the growing horrors of the Reich. Here, surrounded by pine forests and the grey sea, the V2 was born. The challenge was immense. They weren't just improving existing technology, they were inventing an entirely new branch of physics. Rocketry before this era relied largely on solid fuel, essentially glorified gunpowder skyrockets. They were uncontrollable. Once lit, they burned until they were empty. Von Braun needed liquid fuel, alcohol, and liquid oxygen. This allowed the engine to be throttled, controlled, and shut off precisely. But liquid oxygen is a nightmare to handle. It boils at incredibly low temperatures, turning steel brittle and freezing valves shut. For years, failure was the only constant. Rockets exploded on the pad, incinerating the launch towers. They corkscrewed into the sea. They blew up mid-air. The pressure was intense. World War II had begun, and Hitler was demanding results. But slowly, the genius of the team prevailed. They developed the turbo pump, a heart for the beast that could force fuel into the combustion chamber at incredible rates. They invented the inertial guidance system, a brain made of gyroscopes and accelerometers that could feel the rocket's movement and adjust the rudders to keep it on course. Finally, on October 3, 1942, the prototype, the A4, roared to life. Picture the scene. The massive rocket, painted in black and white checkers to help track its rotation, stands trembling on the pad. The engine ignites with a sound like tearing canvas, deepening to a guttural roar that shakes the bones of the observers. Slowly, majestically, it lifts. It doesn't dart away like a firework. It rises on a pillar of flame, accelerating, piercing the clouds. It flew. It reached the edge of space. For the first time in history, a human-made object had touched the void. General Walter Dornberger, the military head of the program, turned to his colleagues and said, "Today, the spaceship was born." But they weren't building a spaceship. They were building the V2, Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, and its target was not the stars, but the cities of the Allies. The wrath of the Führer. By 1944, the war had turned against Germany. The Allies had landed in Normandy. German cities were being pulverized by British and American bombers. Hitler, erratic and desperate, needed a miracle. He needed a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. The V-1 flying bomb, a crude cruise missile, had already been terrorizing London, but it was flawed. It was slow enough to be shot down by fighter pilots or anti-aircraft guns. You could hear it coming. The V-2 was different. The V-2 was inevitable. Standing 46 feet tall and weighing over 27,000 pounds, it was a sleek dagger of aluminum and steel. Its engine produced 56,000 pounds of thrust. In flight, it reached speeds of over 3,500 miles per hour, 5 times the speed of sound. It flew in a parabolic arc, reaching an altitude of over 50 miles before plummeting back to Earth. On September 8, 1944, the weapon was unleashed. In the London suburb of Chiswick, Mrs. Ada Harrison, a 63-year-old woman, was at home. Outside, the street was quiet. There was no warning. At 6:43 p.m., the air was rent apart. A crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep erupted in the middle of Staveley Road. Mrs. Harrison and her 3-year-old granddaughter were killed instantly. It was a shock to the system of the British people. During the Blitz, there was a grim routine. Sirens, shelters, the drone of planes, the explosions. You had agency, you could run, you could hide. With the V2, you were helpless. It was a lottery of death. The British government panicked. They initially tried to cover it up, claiming the explosions were caused by exploding gas mains. The public, with grim British humor, started referring to the V2s as flying gas pipes, but the truth could not be hidden for long. The attacks intensified. Antwerp, a vital supply port for the Allies in Belgium, was hit even harder than London. One tragic afternoon, a V2 slammed into the Rex Cinema in Antwerp. The theater was packed with soldiers and civilians watching a Gary Cooper movie. In a split second, the roof collapsed, burying the audience. 567 people died in the rubble. It was the single deadliest strike of the rocket campaign. The psychological toll was immense. As the writer George Orwell noted in his diary, the V2s were reducing London to a state of neurotic exhaustion. Every silence was a potential death sentence. You could be walking to work, kissing your children goodbye, or sleeping in your bed, and be erased from existence before your brain could register the sound of the blast. Yet, militarily, the V2 was a failure. It was a marvel of engineering, but a disaster of strategy. It was inaccurate. Hitting a specific building was impossible. Hitting a specific city neighborhood was luck. It was horrendously expensive. The V2 program cost the Nazis approximately $2 billion in 1944 currency, comparable to the American Manhattan Project. But while the atomic bomb ended the war, the V2 merely killed a few thousand civilians and drained the Reich of resources that could have built 24,000 fighter planes. Hitler wanted a weapon of terror, and he got one. But terror does not win wars when the enemy is at your gates. The Mountain of Death. While the civilians of London and Antwerp lived in fear of the rocket's arrival, another group of people was living a nightmare in its creation. This is the darkest chapter of the V2 story, a stain that can never be washed away. After the British RAF bombed Peenemünde in 1943, Operation Hydra, the Nazis realized their precious weapon was vulnerable. They decided to move production underground. They chose a site in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, the Kohnstein. Inside this mountain was a labyrinth of tunnels, originally a gypsum mine. The Nazis converted it into a subterranean factory called Mittelwerk. And to staff it, they established a concentration camp, Mittelbau Dora. The conditions in the tunnels defy description. Imagine a darkness so absolute it feels heavy on your skin. The air is thick with rock dust, ammonia, and the stench of unwashed bodies and death. Thousands of prisoners, Russians, French, Poles, Jews, were herded into these caves. They were not treated as workers. They were treated as biological machinery to be used until they broke and then discarded. Survivors recount a living hell. They worked 12, 14, sometimes 18-hour shifts without safety equipment. They slept in the tunnels, on lice-infested wooden bunks, stacked 4 high, with no sunlight for weeks at a time. There was no sanitation. Dysentery and tuberculosis ran rampant. Jean Michel, a French resistance fighter who survived Dora, wrote, "We were no longer men, but shadows." The cruelty of the SS guards was absolute. Any sabotage, real or imagined, was met with public hangings. Prisoners were forced to watch their comrades strangled on cranes in the main tunnels, their bodies left dangling as a warning while the assembly line of rockets moved beneath them. It is a chilling statistic that defines the V2. More people died building the rocket than were killed by it. Approximately 9,000 civilians died from V2 attacks in London and Antwerp. But in the tunnels of Mittelbau Dora, an estimated 20,000 prisoners perished. They died of starvation, they died of beatings, they died of exhaustion. Werner von Braun visited this factory. He walked these tunnels. He saw the slaves in their striped uniforms, saw the brutality. Years later, he would claim he was helpless, that he was a scientist caught in a dictatorship, that he didn't know the extent of the horror. But survivors remembered him. They remembered the well-fed man in the suit walking past the dying skeletons without a glance. He knew. The rocket that would one day inspire the world was built on a foundation of bones. The Collapse and the Great Scramble. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Russians were storming in from the east, a tide of vengeance. The Americans and British were pushing from the west. The V-2 launches ceased not because the rockets failed, but because the launch sites were overrun. For the scientists, the game had changed. It was no longer about winning the war, it was about survival. Von Braun and his inner circle knew they possessed the most valuable intellectual property on the planet. They knew that if they were captured by the Soviets, they might disappear into the Gulag or be forced to work in harsh conditions. They set their sights on the Americans. In a dramatic final act, von Braun led a convoy of scientists and documents through the chaos of a collapsing Germany, dodging SS death squads who had orders to execute them to prevent their capture, and Allied strafing runs. They hid their precious technical drawings in an abandoned mine and made their way to the Bavarian Alps. On May 2, 1945, at a ski lodge in Austria, the brother of Werner von Braun approached an American private from the 44th Infantry Division. In broken English, he said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." It was the intelligence coup of the century. The Americans had captured the brain trust of the Nazi rocket program. This marked the beginning of Operation Paperclip. The Cold War was already icy in the minds of American intelligence. They knew the Soviet Union was the next enemy. They needed the V-2 technology. They needed the men who built it. Washington faced a moral dilemma. These men were Nazis. Some were members of the SS. They had used slave labor. Under normal circumstances, they should have been put on trial at Nuremberg. But pragmatism outweighed justice. The records were scrubbed. The Nazi affiliations were downplayed. Employment histories were fabricated. Von Braun and over 100 of his colleagues were secretly shipped to the United States. It was a whitewash. The U.S. government decided that the knowledge in their heads was worth more than the blood on their hands. White sands and new horizons. The landscape changed dramatically. Instead of the gray, pine-forested coast of Peenemünde, the German scientists found themselves in the blinding white sands of the New Mexico desert. They were technically prisoners of peace, housed at Fort Bliss, Texas. They were paperclip scientists, working for the U.S. Army. Their job was to teach the Americans how to launch the captured V-2s. It was a surreal time. By day, they launched Nazi rockets painted with American insignias into the clear desert sky. By night, they learned English and square dancing. Von Braun, ever the chameleon, began his transformation. He shed the skin of the Nazi armaments manufacturer and donned the persona of the visionary American scientist. He was charismatic, handsome, and brilliant. He began to sell the American public on the dream of space. He appeared in Collier's magazine, writing articles about space stations and trips to Mars. He worked with Walt Disney on television specials about space travel. He became a celebrity. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Soviets had captured the physical remnants of the V-2 factories and the lower-level technicians von Braun had left behind. Under the leadership of Sergei Korolev, the mysterious chief designer, the Soviets were racing to catch up. They used the V-2 as a starting block, reverse engineering it to build their own missiles. The V-2 had become the seed for the arms race. The technology designed to blow up London was now being adapted to carry nuclear warheads between continents. The vengeance weapon had evolved into the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM. The shadow of the rocket grew longer, threatening not just a city, but the entire human species with nuclear annihilation. The footprint on the moon. The climax of this story takes place on July 16, 1969. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, a beast stands on the launch pad. It is the Saturn V. It is the largest, most powerful machine ever built by human hands. It stands 363 feet tall. When it ignites, it produces 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Strapped to the top are 3 American astronauts, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin. Their destination is the moon. And the man watching from the control center, the architect of this moment, is Wernher von Braun. The Saturn V is a direct descendant of the V2. The lineage is undeniable. The liquid fuel, the turbo pumps, the guidance systems, the DNA of the Nazi weapon is woven into the Apollo rocket. When Neil Armstrong took that one small step, he did so off the shoulders of a technology born in the misery of Mittelbau-Dora. It is the ultimate paradox of the 20th century. The greatest achievement of mankind, leaving our home planet to visit another world, was made possible by the darkest regime in history. The double-edged sword. As we look back at the legacy of the V2 rocket, we are left with uncomfortable questions. History is rarely black and white. It is painted in shades of gray. The V2 was a weapon of terror that killed thousands. It was a machine built by slaves in conditions of absolute horror. Its creator was a man who wore the SS uniform and closed his eyes to genocide to pursue his ambition. And yet, that same technology broke the chains of gravity. It allowed us to launch satellites that connect our world, monitor our weather, and guide our travel. It allowed us to look back at the Earth from the moon and see a fragile blue marble floating in the void, a perspective that changed human consciousness forever. Arthur C. Clarke once said of von Braun, "He aimed for the stars, but sometimes he hit London." It is a witty remark, but it hides a tragic truth. The story of the V2 rocket is a mirror for humanity itself. We are capable of profound genius and profound evil, often at the same time. We can build machines that kill, and we can build machines that explore. The fire that burned in the engines of the V2 was a fire of destruction, but it was also the spark of the space age. As we stand in the modern world, surrounded by the benefits of space technology, we must never forget the cost. We must remember the silence of Staveley Road before the explosion. We must remember the darkness of the tunnels in the Harz Mountains. We must remember the names of the slaves as well as the names of the astronauts. The V2 rocket is a testament to the power of science, but it is also a warning. Technology has no morality. It simply does what it is designed to do. It is up to us, the dreamers, the builders, the citizens, to decide where the rocket is aimed. Will it be a weapon of vengeance or a vessel of discovery? The choice, as always, is ours. The Whisper of History. In museums around the world today, you can still see them. The surviving V2 rockets stand silent in display halls. Their black and white checkerboard paint is stark against the museum lights. They look retro, almost quaint compared to modern missiles. But if you stand close enough, and if you know the story, they don't look like artifacts. They look like tombstones. They are monuments to the victims of the Blitz and the prisoners of the camps. And yet, looking at their sleek fins, you can see the shape of the future. You can see the silhouette of the space shuttle, the Falcon 9, and the ships that will one day take us to Mars. The V2 is the ghost in the machine of our modern world. It is the monster that carried us to the stars, and its story is one we must retell, not to glorify the weapon, but to understand the complex, dangerous, and beautiful path of human progress.